Press any button. Very simple technology.
Yes.
Wow.
Ladies and gentlemen, your 60s flashback.
Our group had some extra time, so we made a graphic. This was actually a more interesting discussion than I even could have imagined, because I shared this with the group as a view of how to approach a workforce planning strategy, and that is a very integrated approach, that it is not linear, that it is all these overlapping pieces. And what's interesting is hearing from each group during the debrief, does it all roll up into this, so that you start with resource allocation, and then you go into information and technology design, and then you go into an employment brand discussion, and then you look at networks in terms of how you're going to source externally, and then of course you have to measure to make sure that there's an ROI, and then you look at what your internal communications are going to be, so you have alignment across the organization. So keeping that kind of in mind, and we can come back to that if we want to, we really focus specifically around the resource allocation piece. But what was interesting was the first thing that I think the group realized is that there is not a standard language in place. So as people are talking about workforce planning, strategic talent management, everybody has a different view. And that could just be that, although it doesn't seem like it's that new, I think we're the point that we're at in terms of how business has evolved in the talent market, it potentially is a newer, more robust discussion. So we just kind of broke it down into that there's a short-term view, there's a long-term view. There's a very tactical approach, there's a longer kind of view over the horizon that says we have to look out towards the future. And so keep in mind that what we're talking about is not the short-term tactical aspects, but we're talking about a longer viewpoint of how we look at talent. The other piece that came up that was interesting is that where does workforce planning sit? Does it sit within HR? Does it sit within recruiting? Is it its own entity? And we really didn't solve that in the hour and 15 minutes that we had. But I think it really depends on the organization, the size of the organization, the structure, the culture, and so forth. In my world, it sits with me, which is in recruitment. In EA, it's becoming its own group that kind of intersects with others. And in AOL, I think it sits within HR. So it really kind of ran the gamut. So that was kind of interesting. And then we kind of define, well, really, what is the bottom line? And this is nothing new, but the bottom line is just get the right people in the right place at the right time, and you call it a day. And if you can get that done, then you're obviously ahead of the curve. So we'll come back now and just look at the resource allocation piece. And the key message is here is that the very first step is that it has to align with the business plan. I think we've heard that come up several times throughout the day. But if you go out there and you just start recruiting, or you just sit and you wait until somebody comes to you and says, I need this, it stays reactive and you never really gain any traction. So the first step is, how does it intersect with the business planning process? And we broke that down into 3 different ways that you could approach that. It really depends, again, on the organization and in terms of the maturity of the overall process. So there are 3 different ways. One is that at the very least, it is done in tandem with the business planning process. And hopefully the business planning process is happening at least 3 to 4 months before the actual fiscal year begins, when you would be executing on this. So you have some time. The second piece is that the talent discussion would influence business strategy. So depending on what you know about talent, are you able to then influence where your company invests? So if you can say, gee, I can source people like crazy in Korea, let's go open up a facility in Korea, that adds value to the company. The third piece of it is that talent then becomes central to the innovation process, and innovation is the key differentiator in terms of how companies build a sustainable advantage. Then the talent equation has to be one of investment. And one of the, I think this group talked about over here a little bit, and I forget how you framed it. I have framed it as the, what is the opportunity cost of talent? So everybody comes back and says, oh, we can't overhire, we don't have the budget. But what is the cost of not hiring? If you know it takes 80 days to get somebody in a seat, and you're not going to have somebody there, what's the cost of not having them there? So it's flipping that conversation around a little bit. We talked a lot about supply chain and coming up with that idea that there's slack in the supply chain, and that kind of correlates back to that opportunity cost of talent and how do you build in investments that you make. And where do you use your marketing, your business knowledge? So how much knowledge do you have about your internal metrics? Do you know what your time to fill is? Do you know where you potentially have risk when it comes to skill? So that really calls, to the table that there has to be different groups that are involved in the discussion. That it's partly OD, it's partly HR, it's also the business discussion in terms of where there's investment. And so if you think about that from the perspective of how this would flow, think about that there's this conversation around the business planning process. It brings in the external data, the market data that Dave spoke to earlier, and that's kind of the starting point. What does that look like by market? So for instance, for us right now, our most difficult market is Austin, Texas. Thank you, Hank. But Austin, Texas right now has an unemployment rate of 3.7%. It's almost impossible to find PR people that are sitting in Texas, the Austin area, that are unemployed. So, if we know that, how does that influence what we're going to do to get talent moved into Austin if that's where that person has to sit and the client says that's where the person has to sit? So you can argue about telecommuting all day long, but if the client says they got to be there, they just have to be there. What that causes them to do is they step back and look at, well, what do you know about your internal talent community? And I'm just curious from a show of hands, how many people today feel really good about the view they have into their internal talent community? And they can say they know everything about that talent, who wants to go where, what kind of skill they have, their experience level, what the review looks like. Do they want to be in Hong Kong in 2 years and stay there for an 18-month assignment? Does anybody have that today?
I do.
Cool, let's talk. What company are we?
Made Sequence. We're a small ATS vendor. There's only 40 people.
Oh, so you offer that product today?
Well, I hired every one of them, and I know them all and see them every single day. They all sleep at the place, so we're pretty in tune with what they need and who they are.
So, but the gist of it is that, before you can even think about going externally, you have to know something about your internal talent community so that that's going to influence then the next step. And the next step is, where are you going to invest in people's development? What does somebody's succession planning process look like so that you know what your backups are? And basically what that's going to do is reveal the gaps. So once you have those gaps revealed, then you can go externally. And I just want to make one more point there because of that OD connection. You're also going to be making some really critical decisions about what does your infrastructure look like around learning and development, where you make investments in terms of the pace of growth. And it also then influences that build versus buy decision. So then if we talk about, so we've got the whole internal knowledge piece, that's displayed the gaps. Then you can go externally, and then you kind of get into all this other stuff about certainly the brand, what kind of technology, what kind of CRM tools are you using, what kind of networks are you using, how are you using technology to be able to engage and give an experiential type of learning to candidates as they come to your website. And then the measurement piece, and obviously internal communication. But to walk you through that external piece, I want to use an example around college recruitment. So we, from the data that we have, as an example, we know that in the mid-level of our internal talent community, we have a gap in terms of, from what happened during the dot-com crash, and a lot of PR companies weren't hiring. You weren't seeing people then moving on, so there's a gap at the mid-level today. What that gap has done now is created a tremendous shortage of PR talent, regardless of what industry you want to tap into, regardless if it's agency or corporate. And so if we look today and say, well, gee, how long does it take somebody on average to go from entry-level into this mid-level? Well, to get to the first step of mid-level, it's just under 3 years. Well, so if we say today that we can go on to college campus and we can start recruiting more aggressively and put those development plans in place, at least by the time we get to our next milestone in our strategy of 2010, we're going to be in a much better place. And that kind of comes full circle then back to what we talked about internal, because then it's how you start to move those people around. So that was kind of the overarching view in terms of how it has to flow down and make sure that before you start to do any of this other stuff around sourcing, you know what you're sourcing for and what your need is going to be, and then where you can make some of those strategic investments. Dave, did I leave anything out? Anything? Any questions? Yeah.
So Susan, it sounds like in your workforce planning strategy discussion there was talk about how OD, meaning develop from within, versus recruitment, especially external recruitment, need to be worked together very well. How do you kind of reconcile this with this faction of the recruiting community that wants to run away from HR? Because they seem to be opposite views.
You know, I've been very fortunate that in my current job and in my last job, I worked for somebody that oversaw both, and we were not doing that. In both cases, those individuals had a voice, and probably the person I'm working for now has an even stronger voice and positioning. And so there is this intersection between OD, HR, and recruitment. I'd say even within that, though, how we align is still critical. So, but, you know, if I look at it today, I'd say probably where the intersection is with the CFO and the finance group. I'd say, you know, we have an opportunity today to get information sooner to inform those. So we're putting together a workforce planning council, and that group is going to go through some exercises in scenario planning and make sure that we're demonstrating what the risks are of not getting that. So maybe it comes down to how you create the compelling case around it. Did that answer the question, Neil?
It does. I just think I don't know that there is a good answer, but I hear two camps. One camp is let's all just get together, and another camp is run away. So just interesting to see how that affects workforce planning.
It is true though, because like a lot of the conferences I go to, I'm always amazed at how many recruiters will say I can't stand HR
or I'm not HR,
and it's like it's mind-boggling like how important it is to work together because of the links between. I mean, ultimately the role needs to be filled, and that might be internal, that might be external. So if you're not working together, the manager experience is going to suffer in the end.
And I think it's really critical, especially if you look at internal movement, that almost becomes the most important point of intersection, because HR has to own the relationship with the employee. Recruitment then steps in terms of saying, okay, who do you have? Is this person ready? And gets them placed. But I think the other thing that the group talked about, and please chime in if you want to add anything, is that recruitment has that market expertise that HR doesn't necessarily have, and that's a critical, contribution to make at the table.
Yeah, I think that's so. I think you're hitting to me, which I think is the single biggest opportunity for the field of staffing. Which to me, staffing is about placing people in positions, and whether they come from internal or external is a very secondary thing to placing them in. So make sure you make that boredom more permeable. And the other thing is, if you look at sort of the basic, there are psychological truths. One is high potential candidates. One of the main things they're always looking for is I'm going to do a job where I am going to develop and change. They don't want to get hired to do what you're hiring them to do, so much as they want to get hired to do something new and different and grow into someone else. And the more that you can hire with that in mind, which means having the development people have some sort of sense of, we can train this, we can't train that, hire these capabilities, so the minute people walk in the door, they're on this path of challenge and growth, as opposed to, it's a virtuous cycle, because you end up saying, people take opportunities usually because it's challenge, which means also getting hiring managers to say, we don't want to hire finished products. They cost more, and they'll be dissatisfied on the first day.
Do you have to sit with product planners when you do this?
The product planners?
The people who are going to decide what businesses, what your new products are and what new markets are.
Well, our product is people, so because we do PR. So
in your case, yeah. Talent management is the manager.
Actually,
a lot of companies do widgets.
David raised that with AT&T, where they actually came up with product development and didn't tell anybody in HR who could appropriately plan for the workforce, and therefore they couldn't fulfill the product.
Exactly.
But we do, absolutely, because if you think about that, it has to start with the business discussion, then absolutely. But I think it's also then up to, in our case, it's up to our agency advisory board, where they're going to be investment decisions. So where is there going to be growth? I think as you look at how dispersed if you have a critical mass, it's fairly easy. We have this mix of, I guess it's a hybrid, where we have critical mass in the Northwest, and then we're very widely dispersed across the rest of the country. So, that in some ways brings up a very different variable in terms of how do you get the ease of movement.
I hire who my engineers ask for. They come to me and say, this is what we want to do. Can you find somebody who can help us do it?
Okay.
But I guess,
Mary's got a question, and then
I was just thinking, I was really talking about when you talk about looking inside the bridges with different people in the organization. But I have to say that I think the weak link is between those HR people and the candidates, because that's the last person I would go and tell my hopes and dreams of where I want to be 5 years from now, because I don't think we can build those bridges with the organizations that are too focused on filling the jobs, saving, or the problem people, the people who are most successful in driving revenues, we aren't really considered. And I think oftentimes the external candidates have a much easier time getting those the next bump up in their career. I mean, this, a lot of organizations that might hire a firm of I think more often than not, HR is disconnected from that.
I think the manager.
It's the hiring managers.
So I would build that, because I think one of the things, the managers are not rewarded for promoting people above them, which in very few organizations, a manager is punished for losing high talent from their team, rather than saying, what a fantastic manager you are, you've never progressed, but you keep cycling people through your organization to other parts. And I'm be curious, many here organization compensates managers for internal promotions or lateral transfers, because some of your best internal recruiters, I say, are the managers.
Well, yeah, they want to keep people, or rather continue to think of a different area of the business or they're promoted rather than losing them to the competition.
And they
I think internally it's an artificial labor market, because labor is controlled. Managers will hoard their talent.
right.
They don't want to hoard people going work out of divisions. There's poaching. There's people trying to pop off their bad apples to the division next door. So it's a very unnatural labor market where the people's own interest never comes first. It's their manager who will say, I don't want to lose you, so don't even look at the nice job in Division B.
And HR is protecting the company, not looking at the employee.
So I've been on both sides of the table. I actually grew up on the female side, and now I'm in HR. So I would say that there's a couple of things. Yes, that does happen, and part of that is how you establish a philosophy of talent internally, that if there is transparency into the talent market, that you kind of remove that from the equation. So if you give employees a self-service model that takes the manager out of the equation, and quite frankly takes HR out of the equation, and puts staffing then into a position where they can go in and see their internal talent market, you can change that equation somewhat. And if there are opportunities to not, I've never seen compensation, but I have seen where it's a review component, to recognize somebody for developing people. But, I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase that says it's easier to find a job outside your company than inside. So, that to me is a part of how do you align, everybody internally to say, we have to protect this person. If it means giving them up and retaining them, that's better than having them go work for the competitor, which is where they'll end up.
Can I have a video thought? How about paying at least referrals for internal referrals, paying the reward for internal referrals? That would flush out as well.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Great job, Susan.
I'd just like to say that anybody who spent any amount of time inside a large organization knows it's an Alice in Wonderland experience where up is down and black is white, and where all the improper behaviors you can think of are incentivized in curious and financial ways. So that could be a long conversation about why people get punished for bringing good people in, why people get punished for reducing their budgets, why people get punished for, et cetera, et cetera.